Sorry about that, everyone. I'm on a weird timer here, so it might happen again. Welcome everyone who's watching online, and welcome all the speakers. This event is hosted by Frame of Framed and Network Democracy with support from Europe Direct. This is the second of several sessions under the title Uproot Democracy, in which we will focus on different extractive systems undermining human and non-human rights. The program is leading up to the Court of Intergenerational Climate Crimes, otherwise known as CICC, which is a project by Jonas Staal and Rada de Souza, which will be presented next year in the exhibition space of Frame or Framed. And the exhibition aims to put a number of transnational corporations on a trial for crimes against present and future generations, and thereby shifting the paradigm of rights and laws from a past and present focus and towards an intergenerational one. And the starting point for this series is extractivism, which at its most basic and traditional definition refers to the process of removing natural resources from the land and turned into commodities for sale on a global market. And of course, extractivism is not really that simple. It's deeply ingrained in geopolitical, economic, and social relations. And the distinctions of resources as natural no longer really applies. And that's why for this session, we are looking at data extraction, which is often not the first thing that comes to mind when people think of extractivism. And as much as algorithms are used in our everyday life to seemingly innocently suggest playlists and products and pages through social media, a darker side broods as well. Through targeting and tracing of cookies and browser history, AI is fed to disseminate fake news, influence political votes, and identify debtors. A constant state of top-down surveillance softly applies through the convenience of digital devices and police equipment. And it calls for new ways of hiding and tracking, resisting and rethinking legal systems to account for data and AI. And in this panel, the speakers will unpack the topic from different angles. How can you hide from AI, and how can you survive in a post-surveillance world? And can an algorithm be held culpable in the court of law? And I will introduce each speaker as we go. And for everyone who's watching in the live stream, you can ask questions via the YouTube channel, and we will try to answer them throughout the event. We started this series with a reading room last week, in which the three panelists of tonight were also present. Susana Sanz gave a brief workshop about how to interpret your browser history and how to protect it, and what corporations can do with the information. And we also discussed part of the book that will probably come up today as well, which is called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Susana Sanz. Yeah, let's start. I'll introduce the first speaker, Susana Sanz. She's a private activist and information security trainer, and she's founder of Balkan Tactics, an open space for people using digital media interested in learning how to survive in data extraction web, and with online training and talks for everybody eager to learn about privacy and security options and avoid falling victims of their devices.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. Maybe my talk is going to be quite different from my colleagues, Fieke and Helen. It is because I'm going to try to give you, and I say try to give you because it's quite challenging, some tips on how you stay safe and how you avoid surveillance in 10-15 minutes. Not knowing you and not knowing none of your use is quite challenging. So I'm going to try to keep it as broad and generic as possible. And I'm going to try to also give tips that are useful for most of you. However, you need to think that in internet, there's no one size fit all in privacy and security approaches, because it really needs to be tailored to your needs and to your uses. And to your own capacities, meaning, for example, the same as you're not going to a wedding with a swimming clothes of beach clothes, then you don't use the same security tactics or privacy tactics depending on what you're doing or with whom you're doing it. So let's go. First, I wanted to talk a bit very shortly about balcony tactics. As Frederic has said, is my own project. It is a project where I'm trying to digitalize and socialize the digital knowledge I have, me with some friends, because we understand that it is essential to anyone. And it should not be hierarchical, and it should not be vanguard. It should not be only related to few ones, but actually it should be broader. So with balcony tactics, we aim to make accessible to learn skills, digital skills into this society, and we stress the importance of resilience at the individual level. Companies and governments have their part to do on this, but we as users of the technology have also a say into it. So we try to stress that with different programs. Our programs are a bit shifting because of Corona, and I can imagine for many of us have been affected. So we normally choose for in-person activities because we think it's actually nice to talk about digital issues in person. So not to make everything digital and to try to avoid of our engagement to all of these tools. But however, now it cannot be done. So we do different and we do more other type of things. One of the programs that we have before Corona that was very successful or had great interest among the public to visit us was Algorithmic Kitchen. Algorithmic Kitchen is a recipe to understand big data, and it was initially created by Luis Fernandez as a programming workshop for the BAG, the Technology Society Center in Newmark, Amsterdam. Later, we decided to adapt it ourselves, Luis and me, to deploy it as a regular program in balcony tactics. It became a hands-on session where you could learn how algorithms and different families of algorithms were using your data or were using you to actually meet their aims. And the whole idea is that we do this through actually real cooking. So we will enable different levels of communication and accessibility for everybody. As I said before, we really strive to create a safe space where everybody is welcome. Doesn't matter your background, your attitude, or your knowledge related to technology. We also do now, for example, smart privacy checkups, and this we do it every Tuesday, second Tuesday. So not this year Tuesday, but next Tuesday we will have a session. And if you are curious about privacy around your smartphone, it is a good place to be, because we just have a very informal session where people ask questions and we try to respond, and then from there we build the session. Normally it takes 1 hour, and you can see more information on the website. So I'm not going to lose more time with this, and I'm going to go for the tips if we can. Let's see, how can I do this? Yeah, so thinking that no internet fits all, and please remember this for the future, most of the tips I'm going to give are valid for many of us. However, I want to start making difference between three concepts: security, safety, and privacy. Concepts that are really close to each other, but they are not the same. And many people don't know how to see the difference and confuse them. And all of them are very useful when you want to implement successful privacy of security strategy to protect your data online. So I'm going to use an analogy. Imagine that the internet is your house, and that your photo albums from your family, your personal or vacational photo albums are your photo files of your computer, of your phone. Imagine the different rooms of your house are the different areas of your computer, your different apps, your different things, trying to get an analogy to make this internet more visible, more physical. If I would tell you to give your key to any random person, key of your house, you would probably would not give it, would think I'm crazy. If I tell you, please allow this random person inside your house, let them walk freely, open your drawers, check your albums, do your things, or do their things freely in your house, you would also think this woman is crazy. I don't want to do that. However, this is what we're doing every day and mostly every second on internet. And whether you are aware or not, whether you care or not, this is, if you haven't implemented any security measures, this is happening. So in this analogy, security will refer in our house to why we put a locked door, why we put a fence, or why we put an alarm system. Whether privacy will be why we put curtains on our windows, or why we put a door in different rooms. So what is the real difference? Security refers about how to protect your personal information, so to safeguarding your data, whether this data is at rest, meaning a file, picture in your desktop, or in movement, you are sending this file picture to some of your contact. And security measures normally offer protection against unauthorized access to your data. Well, privacy is more related to the rights you have as a human being, as a person, to control your personal information and how it is used. It is more about safeguarding the user identity, and it is harder to define as is unique to humans and vital to our question of personal dignity and what makes us unique. The problem, I think, around privacy and security is that people does not see the value on their privacy until they lose it. However, when they lose control of their personal data, normally it's too late to fix things. So my idea here is to give you some ideas, some concepts, so you can start thinking whether you need to go forward, how, and what is the best way. So first concept you need to understand is that you can have security without privacy. Good example of this is, for example, Google service. Google service, I don't know if you have forgotten your password for your email, or if you have used your friend's computer, which never was used to open your email, or if you were traveling, you were using a different Wi-Fi of IP address, then suddenly Gmail starts making it impossible to you to actually access to your email. This is because they have a great security department and they are making lots of efforts on not allowing nobody besides yourself and themselves to allow to your content data in Gmail or Google services. However, they are not very good in privacy, meaning that it is possible to have security without privacy, but it's not impossible to have privacy without security. Another example of setups where security works very good, but privacy not so good, is our bank. Banks now, if you haven't choose of opt out, they're selling your transcripts. So how much money you are selling for what? Because this is very interesting information for marketers and commercial people, of course. So banks, they have really strong security departments protecting your money and your personal data, but they do a very poor job protecting your privacy, how you use your data, if you have not opted out of them sharing this information from you. I don't know if this helps you to understand a bit between what is the difference and the tangling between privacy and security. And then safety normally is related to a sum of privacy and security. And safety is related to safety online. And then when you hear, are you safe online, then normally has a bit of security and also a bit of privacy. And some of them are also overlaid. Now I want to talk very briefly about what's internet. And for this, because I think to see me is maybe not so interesting all the time, I choose a video. Let me see if I can share my screen and I do it right. Yeah. A small video from Vincent Cerf, who is one of the fathers of internet, and this is a video he did for a code organization. It's going to be about 2 minutes, and please let me know if audio and everything is working properly.
What is the internet?
The internet is like a popular thing.
Some satellites up there.
I pictured my head with like waves of internet going to the phone.
Somebody told me a cloud once. The internet is a lot like plumbing. It's always moving.
Most people don't have any idea where the internet came from, and it doesn't matter. They don't need to. It's sort of like asking who invented the ballpoint pen or the flush toilet or, the zipper. These are all things we just use every day. We don't even think about the fact that one day somebody invented them. So the internet is just like that. Many, many years ago, in the early 1970s, my partner Bob Kahn and I began working on the design of what we now call the internet. It was a result of another experiment called the ARPANET, which stood for Advanced Research Projects Agency Network. It was a Defense Department research project. Paul Barron was trying to figure out how to build a communication system that might actually survive a nuclear attack. So he had this idea of breaking messages up into blocks and sending them as fast as possible in every possible direction through the mesh network. So we built what eventually became a nationwide experimental packet network, and it worked. Is anybody in charge of the internet?
The government controls it.
Elves, obviously elves.
The people who control the Wi-Fi, because then no Wi-Fi, no internet. T-Mobile, Xfinity.
Bill Gates?
Bill Gates. Right?
The honest answer is, well, nobody. And maybe another answer is everybody. The real answer is that the internet is made up of an incredibly large number of independently operated networks. What's interesting about the system is that it's fully distributed. There's no central control that's deciding how packets are routed or where pieces of network are built or even who interconnects with whom. These are all business decisions that are made independently by the operators. They are all motivated to assure that there is end-to-end connectivity of every part of the network.
So what we like from this video, I hope you like it too, first because he's one of the creators, so it's always nice to give him these comments, but also because I have this really nice schema here that's I'm going to use it to explain you a bit. So what we have learned is that two devices, person A and person B, want to send a message. Then person A is going to send the message, is going to go to their internet service provider, and is going to travel different routes until it arrives to B. This means mostly that internet to work needs to know how to identify you. In order to identify you, this will be done via your IP address, similar to sending a postal letter, where you need to where you need an address to send it to. Computers also need addresses to send and receive your data. The data or the request that you made to the internet is then divided in different small packages. To make it more fluid, to make it more faster, and these data package travel different ways until your the contact you have sent this request. The second thing that is important to mention is that he forgets to say is that because internet was initially designed to be a network between peers, colleagues, it was built to overcome any disaster like nuclear bombs, fire, or any kind of external attack, but it has no security whatsoever inside internet. That means everything we send on internet is traveling plain. And what this means for your security or for your privacy, like any data package has the capacity of allowing to know what are you visiting, what is the site of the visit, what is the site that you are visiting. They can send also or see your user of password if you have logged in into a service. They can see also the data you are transmitting, whether if it's a file or whether if it's a text or whether if it's I don't know what else. And they can see your IPs, your sender and your receiver IPs. This means that without those elements, internet cannot work. But knowing to whom or who sends the information and what information means that everything is open. Since we know that that's maybe not the best idea in 2020, there are some steps that are being taken to conceal the information that travels on the internet. One of them was taken by Google a few years ago, and maybe you notice is about hypertext transfer protocols, HTTPS. I don't know if you realize it, most of you have, of course, in the upper corner of your URL, most of the URLs now come with a little lock that is closed. That means that the traffic to that website or to that service is actually using a transfer layer, transport security layer, and that's what the S from HTTPS stands. Nowadays, Google has not have decided not to browse any website that is not including this protocol in a step towards protecting our privacy. However, what you can see in this schema is that because we need to know whether the sender and the receiver are, and we need to know also a bit of what are they dealing with. If no, we cannot give the request back. This means that all of these nodes that we see on the screen and all the nodes that our data is going to transfer through, they have the potential capacity of read us. So this gives us only two possibilities or two main tactics that we can implement when we are looking for privacy or security online. One is we can opt for anonymity. That means the quality to remain unknown. That means is we allowed internet factors or actors to actually be able to read our message, but not to know who is sending or receiving that message. For that, there are different technologies you can use to actually conceal your IP address, which delivers who are you. Or you can use encryption. And encryption is a process that encodes a message or a file, and only some people having access to that encoders will be able to read it, meaning we'll use algorithms to scramble your data. So even if somebody can read the data, they will not be able to understand it because it will be a scramble, and only the person who is allowed to have that encryption key will be able to decrypt it. Those are the main tactics we have on internet. However, internet security, you need to build it in layers, since no solution guarantee 100% protection. And let me see, I'm gonna change the screen now to myself because I think it's now stop sharing. Sorry. Here we are again. So knowing that we have these two options, anonymity and encryption, you just use them with different apps or different tactics depending on your own needs and capacities. And you just build your security on layers because without that, I mean, there's no one solution is going to protect for all the threats on internet, and we are being very brief and generic here. Meaning that we can have a different strategies, and I'm going to try to share this, but this is quite big file, so I don't know how it's going to be on your screens. So please let me know if it's terrible or not. No, it's not choosing. Sorry, give me a second. Give me a second. I just got myself lost in. Give me a second. I don't know what I did. I don't seem to. Oh, sorry. I just cannot get to the Zoom without actually closing it. I don't know why. Give me a second. Okay, so I'm not able to share this. I don't know. I'm not using Windows normally, and so sorry for that. Just doing exceptions for a large audience. Okay, so I wanted to show you a document we have about strategies of resistance that can be implemented, and because it's a bit exhaustive, not completely exhaustive, but a bit long, I thought maybe to screen it, but I have no possibility. So or maybe I am sharing my screen. Yes, I am sharing my screen. Sorry, I was completely messed up myself. So there's 4 possibilities of strategies, and those are reduce data, compartmentalize your data, obfuscate your data, or fortify your data. Okay, all of them depend of our focus on a different strategy behind it, and reduce is about less data is more. So data is not be created, cannot be collected, analyzed, stored, or sold. And these strategies are based on the premise that the less data we produce, the better. Some ideas or some applications, clear applications of how to do this would be turn off your devices when you are not in use. For example, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth of NFC, sorry. Put your phone on flight mode, often to turn off your GPS on your mobile, delete applications that you no longer use, change of review your applications permits, limit data generation by resisting giving information. How you interpret that is well, questioning yourself if you need to post that information about your breakfast, about your swimming pool swim, or about this last thing you want to share on Instagram or whatever, maybe it's not so necessary. Delete networks and browser histories, as we talked the other day, or block unwanted access. And clean your online identity, but those are like tactics that maybe are longer to explain, so I'm just like really briefly going around them. Compartmentalize is to diversify. It means having different personas and different ways of using technology, meaning you can use a browser for your social network, and you can use a different browser for your financial stuff. You can use also a different browser for your personal or for your work related time, but meaning that you compartmentalize, so you just actually put different things in different baskets, and you need to be very focused on not mixing those baskets, because if not, your compartmentalizing strategy will not work. So it's trying to dissociate your work life from your personal life or any other persona that you can create it on internet. Use different email accounts, but never your daily accounts, or create email accounts ad hoc per service or per website or application you use. Create different accounts where you or you share different personalities or different approaches, and so on, like trying to keep clean your data. So if somebody get data from one browser, does not get in, or does not imply that it gets all the data from your personal work, searching, and I don't know, thoughts. Then obfuscation goes about hiding in the crowd. It means to confuse companies with no's. It was mentioned by Helen in the previous session about this application where you can actually set as an add-on on your browser, and it will create random data. So all of this profiling or behavioral profiling will be not so easy to work on you because of the rare nodes that you're going to share. And then we will suggest to create or use VPNs, change your names on your phone, use fake phone numbers on your contacts, on your contact list. Leave your phone at home sometimes, so they cannot really define your daily patterns or daily routines. Create different social media profiles with similar names of pictures, but that they have different meanings and different doings. Mask your individual identity on Facebook by creating groups accounts of any other types of identities. Create noise by clicking random apps, like for example, Ad Nauseam. This was the application that Helen mentioned last week. Or use VPNs to change your IP address depending on your setup. They're different, break your routines, there are different tactics that you can implement. And Fortify is my devices, my rules. So you know what you're doing and you create a strategy that is adapted to you and your needs of security and privacy. This could be, for example, full encryption disk and full encryption on your mobile. I have also small little vaults or little encryption areas in your devices where you can store extra security or extra sensible information. Use open source applications whenever it's possible, mostly because they're audited and because people can. I see Helen is making a sign. I don't know if. Oh, sorry. So I was there. My rivals might do so. Using open source means that actually you can not know yourself because probably you don't have the skills of programming to actually audit these application codes, but you trust the community when they audit these applications and they say, verified or not, that what the company says that application does, it actually be done and it's not more or less. You can set passwords on your phone and devices. You can put passwords also on specific applications due to the sensitive information they can manage. You can modify all Google apps and Google permissions, create barriers like antivirus, firewalls, keep programs up to date, keep software up to date. Yeah, there's like a lot of different tactics that we can use, and I think I've been talking super long already, so I'm going to leave it here. I'm sorry for the rest. It was difficult to talk so much in so little time.
Thank you, Susana. It's really interesting. I have already a lot of questions, and also if you, the viewers that are watching, once again, you can pose the questions, and then we will discuss them in the end. I think for now really thank you for the talk. We're going to go to Fieke Jansen. Fieke is a PhD candidate at the Data Justice Lab at Cardiff University. She is interested in re-politicizing data and technology by understanding its historical, social, cultural, and political context in Europe. Her research focuses on the impact of implementing data-driven decision-making in European police forces on marginalized communities. Take it away.
Okay. I'm also going to share my screen so you don't see my talking head. And I think you should see it now. Thanks for inviting me to speak, and thanks, Susana, for talking about practical tactics and strategies that people can use to protect themselves online. I'll be talking about resisting surveillance in public spaces. And just as sort of maybe for a positioning of where I'm coming from is that next to my PhD, where I look at how police are using data and technology in Europe, I have a long history on internet, human rights, privacy, and digital security, where I have done numerous roles, including training and creating self-learning materials like Susana. And I'm also a Mozilla Public Policy Fellow, where I've been working on a project that I'm presenting later on at the end of the presentation, but I've also been engaging in the public consultation around the AI white paper that was written by the European Commission and the data strategy. So I have different intersection points on the topic of today. And sort of, I actually want to do two things. One is I want to set the scene a bit, like where are we now? What's happening, or what do I see happening that I find important? And then I want to go into practice of resistance. So how are people resisting artificial intelligence by showing some projects that I find quite inspirational, and also presenting a project of myself. So what's happening, setting the scene? Well, I mean, we saw Vinsurf talk about sort of like how the internet started, which was really for sort of research and military purposes. But sort of in the transition to a commercial internet, all of a sudden other things became important. And sort of in the reading group last week, we talked about surveillance capitalism, but it has also been called information capitalism, communicative capitalism. There are basically many words to describe the fact that data has become super important in our contemporary society, and that there is a lot of like sort of financial gain in trying to extract as much data as possible from people. And this is sort of like the rise of the commercial internet has sort of led to the accumulation of knowledge, wealth, and power in the hands of a few. So where it used to be the oil companies in the States that were those like in power, now we actually see that Silicon Valley, and especially GAFAM, so the 5 big companies from Silicon Valley, Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft have become some of the biggest companies in the world. So they have accumulated a lot of data about people, a lot of wealth, being some of the, I think Apple and Google are the number 1 and 2 most wealthiest company in the world, but also power, because a lot of people feel incapable of sort of challenging Google and Facebook or Apple on their practices. So we're seeing sort of this, there's been a slide towards the big tech companies. And on the other hand, what we're seeing both in society at large, but especially also with state and public authorities, that there's like an enormous tech optimism. So when something goes wrong, say we have a global health pandemic, the first thing people will go on national TV and say is that we're going to create this COVID app that's going to sort of help us get out of lockdowns and things like this, without actually thinking through what does it mean to create apps to monitor how people's behaviors are, whether or not they're in the same locations. And this is what we can also see sort of on a policy level. In Brussels, like I've mentioned, they're working on this AI, the white paper on AI. So the European perspective on AI, why is it important? What do we want from it? What do we need to regulate? And they call it trustworthy AI because there's a belief that if AI is created in Europe, it will hold European values and thus it will be trustworthy. So there's a lot of assumptions under there. But what's really important to realize is that even though we're talking about AI regulation, if you closely read sort of the data strategy of Europe and the white paper on AI, you actually see that it's because Europe is afraid of missing out on the next race. So we sort of missed out on the commercial internet where the power is in the hands of a few companies in Silicon Valley and China. And sort of as Europe, we missed out because we don't have access to the raw data, the data about behavior of our citizens, because it's in the hand, it's like on servers outside of our territories. And sort of to avoid missing out of this next race, we want to invest in artificial intelligence so we can be able to compete against China in Europe. China and America. So it has less to do about human rights and more to do about sort of basic economics and geopolitics. So we're sort of seeing these huge monumental shifts where power is slowly transitioning into other hands. There's a geopolitical race. And then there's sort of, on the other hand, we see the responsibilization of the user. So as Susana mentioned, there's quite a lot of tactics and strategies that we can use to actually protect ourselves online, and that we have to because sort of our data has become very valuable, so everybody wants to have access to it. But it's also really problematic because on the one hand, Susana was explaining how the internet works, and in this video of FinSurf, we actually see that people's understanding of the internet is very basic. And I spent years doing trainings, and sort of when you ask people what the internet looks like, they draw a cloud or they draw sort of like very nice representations of figures, but nobody really draws the physical infrastructure or the power holders within this physical infrastructure. So while sort of the knowledge of the user sort of stays at the same level, sort of the systematic exploitation increases dramatically. So this asymmetry of power is just growing and growing, and still we as a society, but also within a lot of our understandings about the internet, we think security and privacy is the responsibility of the user, whereas actually you could say maybe it's the responsibility for other entities, because how much can you actually do as an individual user against all of this power? So that's sort of where we are. And then now comes the next conundrum, which is like, it's complex enough as it is already online, trying to figure out how sort of to keep ourselves safe and secure. On the other hand, how sort of there's a lot of data extraction happening. There's an entire market created around our data. And now what we're seeing is that the online surveillance is moving back to the offline surveillance through the use of cameras, facial recognition, voice recognition, so sort of live tracking people on phone infrastructures, gait, which basically means cameras identifying sort of movement of people, so patterns of movement through sort of recognizing your body, so not your face, but your body. Then we have Wi-Fi tracking happening at different locations, also in Amsterdam, for instance. And here our bodies and our phones become the object of surveillance. So while we're still grappling with how to protect ourselves online, and sort of this is already an unfair battle, now the surveillance have gone, sort of the digital surveillance is increasingly going offline. So this is sort of where we're seeing it. And also why I am interested in sort of practices of resistance, and especially resisting the use of AI in public spaces. Because this is, by the way, a picture of the headquarters of the new headquarters of Apple. But what really comes from the Silicon Valley narrative is that, well, here they say it's a mindset, not the location. Not my text, by the way. This is the text of somebody else that is a random picture I found on the internet. But what I found interesting when we started looking at sort of AI in public spaces is that there's a lot of sort of assumptions or narratives people want us to believe. And one is that AI is already here. And in most cases, it actually is not artificial intelligence yet, but they want us to believe it's already here. And with they, I mean sort of the tech industry. The other thing is there's always this discussion about sort of that those in power, in public authorities, those who are working in sort of the commission are stupid and they have no idea what they're talking about, and that therefore law will always be behind technology. And the third one is that because it's already here, our legislators don't know what they're talking about. There's nothing we can do about it. So we just have to accept that sort of this type of surveillance is increasingly becoming active in our public spaces. And sort of having been involved sort of in this public consultation on the AI white paper is that actually people in public authorities, not all of them, but the people responsible for these sort of portfolios, they do know what they're talking about. They might not agree politically with me on what the solution is, but they do have a clear understanding of what they're talking about. If I look at what's being implemented in sort of Europe with policing, AI is definitely not here yet. There's still a lot we can do about it because most of it is just basic statistical modeling. And then the third is that you actually can do something about it. So we have to break these assumptions because we actually want to, I feel like we shouldn't let Silicon Valley determine how our society looks like. I think we should determine how our society looks like. And this is, in my sort of understanding, we can do this through practices of resistance. And if we look at technology and the history of technology, but also the history of capitalism, is that resistance has often been a way to collectively bargain for specific rights. And it will never sort of, it hasn't in the past, and I don't think in the near future, it will allow us to get rid of these things, but it will allow us to negotiate for some collective rights. So I want to give you some examples of some sort of practice of resistance that I've seen, which I've really enjoyed. The one was this summer. There was like massive student protest in the UK. I don't know if people have read the news or seen these, but all like out of the blue, students started protesting with signs saying, "Fuck the algorithm," which was quite unique that like an entire sort of demographic rose up and said, we no longer want to be governed by algorithms. So what happened was because of COVID-19, kids in the UK couldn't do their A-levels exams. And then the government said, don't worry about it. We have this really trustworthy and very smart algorithm that's going to determine your grade. And then you can go to university. So it's okay that you don't take your exam because of COVID, you won't be disenfranchised. And what happened was that actually, as soon as the grades started coming in, it turned out that kids with sort of lower grades that went to more expensive high schools actually got higher grades than they should have, than kids coming from poor neighborhoods but who had good grades. They were actually given lower grades. This doesn't make any sense. But it turned out that it didn't, sort of your individual merits and your individual history of grades were not the only indicator that determine your final grade. They also looked at sort of the history of your school. So in the UK, which is quite a class society, if you went to a very expensive high school, that means that actually your history, the history was quite good, and that would inflate your grade. So your grade would get better with the algorithm. Whereas if you lived in a poorer neighborhood, your school actually maybe historically have scored less good or less well. And so it would deflate your grade. So you would actually get downgraded. And so this started quite of a ruckus because it basically was a discriminatory algorithm where you got graded based on your socioeconomic status and not actually on how well you did in certain tests, for instance. And after 3 days of protest, they actually retracted the algorithm. And then the teachers, the grades were determined on the basis of the teachers' observations, which apparently was fair. So that was one way in which it was challenged. Another one is that we see lawsuits all over Europe. So Liberty took to court a police force in the UK about the use of facial recognition. And while they lost the first trial, they actually won in the appeals court, where they said it's illegitimate to actually for the police to use facial recognition in the wild, and especially in a context like protest, because this means it actually infringes on your right for your freedom of assembly, but also your right to protest in the UK, and it's actually not constitutional. So they actually won the appeals court, and which says that in the current legal framework, it's actually unconstitutional to use facial recognition. So these are just two examples of sort of how people have been challenging the algorithm. And I think this is one of my favorite artworks, and this is about predictive policing. So 3 artists from New York said, can we flip the narrative about predictive policing? Predictive policing basically looks at sort of the police records, and they look at crime, date and location, and they try to predict what the likelihood is in the next 2 weeks usually that a crime will happen in a specific location. You get a map of the city and you see sort of the red spots, and those will be the areas where crime will happen. Now, these artists said, let's flip the narrative, and instead of applying predictive policing to high impact crime, so it's like robbery, burglary, and pickpocketing, which usually happens with certain demographics, let's flip it to financial crime. And so if we apply this to financial crime, then where would the algorithm tell us where this would happen? And if you look at the map, you can see it's the map of New York, and sort of all the red dots are the financial districts. So it's in Manhattan, in the financial district. And then they went a step further and said, okay, so now we know the location of where financial crime is most likely to take place in the next 2 weeks. Can we also find the most likely suspect? So they went to LinkedIn, and they basically started scraping the faces of bankers. And so you also see here a face of a sort of 45-year-old white male, a little bit overweight, and he is the typical person, according to the algorithm, who would commit financial crime. And now it might be funny to do this flipping the algorithm, but I've used this example quite a few times to say, okay, would we find it legitimate to, on the basis of this data and sort of these predictions, which actually sound quite logical, financial crime will happen sort of in the financial district in Manhattan by bankers who are white male in approximately 45, would we find it okay that the police would do the same to them as they do to the kids who are associated to high impact crime? So could they stop and search them on the street, for instance? Could they ask them to access their mobile phones without a warrant, without anything? Could they stop them on the streets in Manhattan and start to harass them? And then the answer is often no. So why do we accept it for other types of crime when we actually don't accept it for financial crime, which you can, like, for argument's sake, say it's actually worse for society to have financial crime happen than high impact crime maybe. So you can flip the narrative, because often when you flip the narrative or you invert it, you start seeing the issues that you otherwise don't see. And then you have sort of disrupting the algorithm, and especially with sort of the use of surveillance technology in the public space and facial recognition. There's been quite a few sort of art projects or fashion projects that have been trying to sort of disrupt the technology from working properly. So Adam Harvey, he produced facial paint, sort of patterns that you can paint on your face so that the algorithm doesn't recognize your face as a face. This is a facial jewelry, which is very beautiful. And all of it is to break a certain triangle that the facial recognition algorithm is looking for in your face. There's also like shirts you can wear that make gait recognition not work anymore. You have certain material you can wear that won't allow thermal imaging from recognizing the body heat of your body. So there's like different sort of projects that are disrupting the algorithm from actually doing what it says it's supposed to do, like finding a face, identifying your voice, all of these things. And for me, sort of like, I think it's quite important to recognize, as well as for the online tactics, but also for all of these offline sort of strategies of resistance, is that they only work for a specific period of time. this facial paint. It doesn't work anymore for algorithms already more sophisticated in the recognizing of faces. And sort of this goes for the same. This also goes for like ad blockers. In the end, if you use a lot of Google products, you can use an ad blocker, but they can still tell a lot about you. So a lot of these resistance practices only work for a period of time. So we shouldn't see them as an ultimate solution, but we should see them as a temporary bargaining power, a collective bargaining power, to maybe try to figure out a different way, a social, legal way to get more equal society. And for this, actually, the first step is that people need to understand what's happening, because if we don't even understand the internet, how can we then understand sort of the surveillance that is happening in the public spaces, which is often so much more complicated with actors, technology, sort of the algorithms behind it. So me and some other people, we started, it's in an alpha state. We created these low-tech canvas against high-tech surveillance. So the idea was based on sort of some of these practices of resistance that I showed before. And they're supposed to be, they're going to be printed on fabric, and they're supposed to be sort of explorer guides that you can take into your own neighborhood, into your own city, so that you can start to get a lay of the land. And they're about facial recognition, thermal imaging, and Wi-Fi tracking. And the idea of them is not only to sort of in shorthand try to explain to people how these technologies work, but also where they're used, get people go out in the streets to see if they see specific cameras, if they can play with certain resistance practices, but also if they can join the conversation. So join your own digital rights movement. Try to exercise your data subject rights in Europe, because there are actually quite a few things you can do to maybe not, I mean, people say regain control of your data. I think it's more to annoy those people who are collecting your data and start sort of becoming part of this discussion. So here's the canvas of facial recognition. And then with a lot of bits of freedom, we also talked about it, that sometimes we need to make these sort of seemingly invisible structures visible. So can we sort of have these exercises where people can throw these LED lights at cameras in the city so that they light up again? Because what we see, I don't know if anybody's ever been to the tube in London, you walk into any tube station and it says, welcome, you're on CCTV cameras, and everybody just walks past them, and sort of these cameras become normalized. They fade away in the background, and we don't even actively realize anymore that they're there. So could you like throw like LED lights and light them up like a Christmas tree, so we start noticing them again, start noticing sort of these cameras in all of our public spaces, because maybe we never agreed to having them there to begin with. So we have one about thermal imaging, which actually isn't, it's sort of a military technology that hasn't been seen that much in civilian spaces, especially not in Europe. But actually what's the interesting thing about COVID is that now it started showing up. So we started where before you had drones with thermal imaging by the US military to do drone killings in Pakistan. All of a sudden now we have like drones with thermal imaging flying over cities and refugee camps to sort of see if people are keeping distance or not, if sort of temperature is spiking, things like this. And this is not proven technology, like especially not for these use cases. So we're just trying to get people to play around with it in their cities, and also recognize their rights. And especially here with thermal imaging, we made the link to COVID. So what are your rights about your medical data when you want to enter into a place and people are asking you all these questions, and what happens to it? And then the last one is Wi-Fi tracking, and then I'll stop because I feel like I've talked long enough as well. I feel with Wi-Fi tracking, this becomes a really interesting narrative where you see where it's sold to a lot of us about security. So we track Wi-Fi, we track you through Wi-Fi in public spaces. Today was even in the newspaper that the NS, so the Dutch railway, is tracking us to sort of see, this is through gate, but to sort of see if we're keeping 1.5 meter distance, yes or no, in train stations. And so when you go into the public and ask people, how do you feel about Wi-Fi tracking? So we went into the city of Amsterdam and asked this to people, and like a lot of people said, oh, well, I mean, we don't want the Wi-Fi tracking to happen, but we understand that in certain places we might need to do it for security. And one of these places was said, for instance, the railway stations, because there's an increased level of an attack there. So yeah, of course you can use technology for security purposes. And then the interesting thing is, when talking to people who are somehow connected to these implementation of Wi-Fi, sort of surveillance in public spaces, somebody mentioned that actually Wi-Fi tracking in stations is used maybe for security, but it's also used to sort of calculate the rent costs for Albert Heijn, because they can see how many people went into the shops and how long they were into the shops. So I feel like we have to sort of open up the discussion, but also have a fairer discussion, because a lot of them are based on assumptions that are not even true. Because it would be a very different answer if we ask, are you okay with the NS collecting your data and tracking you through the station so they can figure out how much rent they charge the Albert Heijn? That's a very different question than, are you okay with Wi-Fi tracking at the station for security reasons? These are two different questions, and I feel like we have to unpack them, because on sort of general terms like security, we're giving away a lot of data, and it's actually used for a lot of other things. So this is why I find resistance so interesting and important, because actually it is an ongoing struggle over how we want our societies to be organized. And these resistance tactics, we should see them as our collective bargaining strategies, instead of sort of how it's often framed as people who are tech skeptics or Luddites or whatever names you're given. It's not that people want to be difficult. It's basically that they want to ensure that our human rights and sort of our social, the social cost of society are not too much. And that's it. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Fieke, for that. Very interesting, once again, information. I think we're moving from somehow this surveillance and the resistance towards that surveillance to another scenario whereby the algorithm has already done what it's doing generally, and then is the new question arises whether this algorithm is culpable and liable about their actions. And I think Helen will talk more about this. Helen is a multimedia artist whose work stems from an interest in the new sovereign territories of the internet. She is preoccupied with the way the immaterial meets forms of life, particularly in the social realm, teasing out questions of responsibility and autonomy.
Hi. Okay. Wow, it's a very confusing time at the moment, and it's very interesting to hear, especially what Fieke was talking about, that kind of sort of binary between the usefulness of data and the way that it can be exploited. Anyway, I'm going to talk about this, and thanks, by the way, Frame Framed, for inviting me to this conversation. It's been really good. So I'm going to talk about an artwork that I made back in 2016. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Okay, can you see that? Yeah. Can I make it bigger? View. Full screen. Where's Zoom? Enter full screen. Oh, that's full screen. Okay, wait a minute. 100%. Sorry, slide only. There we go. That's better. Yeah, so this is an installation, and it was finally put on show for the first time in 2016. It's called The Trial of Superdebthunterbot, and it consists of a film, a jury bench for 12 people, because in the UK we have 12 people who sit in a jury and decide whether something's guilty or not. So I work with a designer to make this kind of quite pretty jury bench, and also some drawings, some courtroom drawings, because also in the UK we have this kind of rather unusual tradition of basically you can't film in courtrooms, so someone actually has to go in and do a drawing. And in fact, they don't even do the drawing in the courtroom, they do the drawing out of the courtroom. They have to go in and memorize it and then do the drawing outside. It's really, you can write in a courtroom, but you can't draw. So hang on, I'm just gonna bring up some text because I've got a few quotes that I'd like to talk about. Yeah, so in 2015, I put an algorithm on trial, and it was my first ever performance work, and it was staged for an exhibition called Collaborate in the Oriel Sikkerth Gallery in Wrexham. And the work was performed by lawyers Uana Labontu Radu and Laurie Elks, who wrote the prosecution and defense speeches, and an actor called Mark Frost, who played the judge. So you can see that's Mark there. I'm just going to go to the next slide if I can. Hang on. So here you can see this is Southwark Crown. Oh, sorry, this is actually, these are the two lawyers, Laurie and Uana. So the algorithm was housed in a see-through computer made by an artist called Daniel Dressel, and that sat in the dock. And the jury at the time was comprised of the opening night attendees. So basically the first time I staged it was just literally in an art gallery. And it was during my study on the MFA at Goldsmith between 2014 and 2016 that I began working around the subject of finance, since I was commuting from Manchester to London every week. And I witnessed not only the growing wealth disparity between the two cities, but the phenomenon of the financial capital. It's quite a different world from now. I'm currently actually sat in London Bridge, and I've just cycled through the city and it's completely dead. My research led me to explore the infrastructural technologies like algorithms, which are the kingpins of our online world. The bedrock of financial transactions, these algos are used universally in the quest to capture and learn from big data, predict risk and outcomes, and perform tasks. I became fascinated with the opaqueness of this world and felt compelled to open it up somehow and make it tangible. So again, it's what Fiekke's talking about, you know, this kind of black box mentality. And I suppose what I try to do with my artworks in lots of different guises, particularly in relation to technology, is to sort of, you know, take a subject and try and understand it from the inside. So I suppose the idea of putting an algorithm on trial and getting lawyers to actually write the prosecution and defense gave me a kind of insight, gave me a kind of insider view. It kind of really allowed me to contemplate something that I actually didn't understand very much. And I became fascinated with the opaqueness of this world. I'm preoccupied, like Frederick said, with the way that the immaterial meets forms of life, particularly in the social realm, teasing out questions of responsibility and autonomy. Now, there's an interesting quote from Boris Groys. He says, "The visualization of the invisible is the most radical form of its profanation." So opening up subjects like finance, or as Benjamin Bratton states, planetary scale computation, which is elusive, vast and unfathomable, is an underlying aim of mine. Making this new computational structure visible and comprehensible is a driving motivation. I also wondered whether a non-human entity, like an algorithm, could be responsible for the acts that it performs. And so what this piece actually came about because, well, various sort of readings that I did around the subject, and one of them was an essay by Susan Schullppi. Susan Schullppi works at Goldsmith, and she heads up forensic architecture, and she wrote an essay about the responsibility of algorithms in drone warfare, where operational control and decision making are increasingly outsourced to machines that execute. And this led me to wonder what might happen if once a deed is done, can there be a trial and can a non-human be punished? So I decided to concoct a narrative which on the surface seemed a little less sinister. And so this piece revolves around a speculative scenario, and it's not too, at the time actually, I mean, I also read an article by the London Review of Books, and I was reading about how the student loan company had been sold for much less than it was worth. And I was just thinking about how I could tie in a narrative, you know, around algorithms. So I came up with this idea that a debt collecting company buys up the student loan book, and it uses unconventional means to ensure fewer loan defaulters by targeting individuals through the use of big data. And it's quite funny because in 2015, when I started working on this, it kind of felt I mean, it's kind of crazy, but it almost felt like this was not real, but, you know, actually this was really quite possible. So a chain of events leads to deaths in medical trials. And basically, if you imagine this algorithm is basically employed by a debt collecting company. It scours the net looking for people who are going to default on their student loan, and it places job adverts on their pages. And this algorithm has no moral capacity, so it could place, you know, a job advert for sex work or working for Amazon, or, you know, all manner of things. So it puts an advert from medical trials, and in the story, some students, you know, decide to partake in the medical trials and they die, and it's who's culpable, basically. Is it the algorithm? Is it the company? You know, is it the coder? So in 2016, I staged the second performance of the Trial of Superdebthunterbot at Southwark Crown Court and shot the 45-minute film of the same title, which I hope that some of you might have seen. I've sent round the link. I think it's still going to be available for about 24 hours. So if you do want to see it, just, you know, use the link. And this is a screenshot of Laurie and Awana, who are, you know, in Southwark Crown Court. I brought together a jury of a variety of individuals, kind of made a fake jury letter, which I sent out to them, and they all duly turned up. And actually in that picture, the woman that you can see sat behind Laurie Elks, behind the lawyer, she's actually a journalist for the Financial Times, and she also sort of basically wrote an article about the trial. So the full installation of the work, so here you can see, this is the see-through computer that I was talking about. You can see it in more detail there. So the full installation of the work comprises a modernist jury bench to provide the audience with a sense of participating in the process of justice by taking their own place within the installation, and courtroom drawings. So you can see these are some of them. I wonder if I can just make this. Nope. Sorry, trying to make it a bit clearer to see. And these drawings were produced during the first kind of performance that happened in Oriel Sycharth. So if you can see here in the bottom left corner, there's two people kissing behind the lawyers, which is quite, I thought was quite beautiful actually. But it just happened that there was a second performance happening in the very first performance that we did, where two people were kissing for about 6 hours. So these are concoction of drawings, which, and I'll show you, there's another one, which came from the first performance. But here you can see in the second performance, we've got a drone shot because I used drones in the filming. And in here you can see on the right, you can see the Southwark Crown Court logo. So the new sovereign territories of the internet and how these grind upon the old horizontal sovereign territories of land, sea and mineral wealth became very pertinent in the staging of the performance at Southwark. In the film, I emphasise the old horizontal territory of the decrepit courtroom, tacked together by tape, as the furniture and material infrastructure of the courtroom is shown for what it is, a 1980s flagship court, which now looks tired. I mean, you can see it here. But I'll show you a clip of the film in a minute, which now looks tired and underfunded in the age of austerity. The idea that the internet is a vertical territory is teased out by Benjamin Bratton's book, The Black Stack. He says, planetary scale computation takes different forms at different scales. Energy grids and mineral sourcing, catonic cloud infrastructure, urban software, public service privatization, massive universal addressing systems, interfaces drawn by the augmentation of the hand or the eye or dissolved into objects, users both overdetermined by self-quantification and exploded by the arrival of legions of non-human users, sensors, cars, robots. Instead of seeing the various species of contemporary computational technologies as so many different genres of machines spinning out on their own, we should instead see them as forming the body of an accidental megastructure. Perhaps these parts align layer by layer into something not unlike a vast, if also incomplete, pervasive, if also irregular, software and hardware stack. So I suppose what I was trying to do in the film from that huge quote was kind of layer the feeling of, like, you know, the reality of the courtroom in Southwark alongside this kind of vertical sovereignty, this kind of these layers that the internet and this computational entity, you know, kind of global entity is. I enjoyed the genderless silence of the algorithm sitting in the dock, blinking elusively, and I utilised different perspectives and Bratton's concept of verticality through the use of several cameras, including HD cameras, GoPros and drone footage, in order to gain close-ups and aerial footage. And I tried to stack the imagery and allow this to underline the cutting edge technology and surveillance themes of the work. So you can see here in this image, you know, you've got a drone flying above Laurie and Awana's head. So what I'd like to do is give you a little, let's see if I can get you on. Oh, hang on a minute. I'm lost now. Can you see? Can you guys see? Which screen can you see? Can you see this video?
It's sort of frozen for me in the middle.
Ah, hang on. I'm going to stop share and I'm going to just share again because I've got a... So I'm going to try and just show you a little bit of the beginning of the video and a little bit of the final jury scene because it kind of gives you a taster for it. Okay, let's see if I can make that. Here we go. Oh, hang on. I might have to stop it one more time. Sorry. I'm going to do it again just to check that I've put the sound. Here we go. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you could follow me. Can I ask that you please form a line from this corner to this corner? Just from here, sir? From here? Just from here, sir. And down this way. Facing me. Once you go into the court, the jury benches are immediately to your right. If I could ask the first 6 members of the jury, from yourself, sir, to you, madam, to please file into the back row, starting with the seat closest to the judge's bench. Can then ask the last 6 jury to please file into the front row, once again starting closest to the judge's bench. Once the court's ready, I'm going to be bringing His Honour the Judge in. I'll do this by shouting "Court rise." When you hear this phrase "Court rise," it's important that you all stand for His Honour, and please remain standing until His Honour has sat down. If everybody's ready, then please follow me.
Okay. So yeah, so that's the kind of beginning of the film. You know, it introduces the jury, and then obviously we have the judge who comes and gives a summing up of what's happened, and then we have the 2 prosecution and defence speeches, and then to finish off, I'm going to try and just show you a little bit of the final like jury. No, hang on a minute, I'm gonna have to take it up. 30, should be about here. Yeah, this is just the final kind of when the jury go out and start deliberating.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of the jury, you will now retire so that you can reach your verdict. Please bear in mind that in order to reach a verdict, 10 or more of you must be in agreement. We will reconvene presently to hear that verdict.
Rise. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could gather your paperwork and follow me, please. We gather in this corner here. Just gather into this corner here, mate. The court has empowered me to appoint one of your number as foreperson, and madam, I will select you. It is your responsibility to chair the discussions of the jury and to deliver the jury's verdicts once you return to court. I'd ask that you now form a circle and begin your deliberations, and if any time you do reach a verdict, please indicate that fact to me. Thank you very much.
What do you think, guys?
Should we go according to each question?
Okay.
Should we do a vote? Yeah, for each?
Okay.
So, do they have a duty of care? Raise your hands for yes. Guilty. 1, 2, 3. No duty of care. Should we discuss this because that's a fundamental issue? Right. Can someone summarize why they're unconvinced?
Yeah, it doesn't have any control over its agenda. It doesn't have any choice of what its agenda is.
Because?
Because it's programmed.
It has no agency.
But similarly, we could say the same thing about a human being. because actually it's a matter of, kind of philosophy and religion to see whether or not actually our lives are predetermined by a certain force that's outside of our control.
Yeah, but we have an agenda, we choose where we're aiming towards, but it doesn't have a choice over its agenda, it's aiming to meet the introduced.
It always has a freedom of choice, actually. It's my belief, that's all.
Yeah.
Algorithm doesn't have freedom of choice.
But it does, because it learns
the algorithm have a duty of care? Why would you think that the algorithm has a duty of care?
It has a duty of care because it can actually modify its own kind of understanding of the world depending on the knowledge that it gains.
But if it doesn't have the, if it's not programmed to have empathy, to recognise vulnerability, but that's the person who programmed it should have included an awareness for vulnerability, so that
can be in a programmable agenda, but if it's not,
it should be programmed not to use illegal things because it uses illegal tests.
I think
it should put everything what is illegal shouldn't be included in this algorithm because you cannot do the travels here.
I get that, but I think we have a policy opportunity here because ultimately what we see is that we can't sue the company that is responsible for imbuing this algorithm with the agenda. What we have the opportunity to do is to actually use this algorithm as a certain vehicle for a just cause.
I think if the programmer was alive, there would be no question that they would be standing trial.
The programmer is subject to the company's agenda. So it's a similar question that we had with Eichmann, who was the guy trialed in Jerusalem, who was responsible for the management of delivering Jews to Auschwitz, right? And so the question was he just a peg within a system? So should he be responsible for?
Okay, sorry, I don't want to leave you with too much of it, but it kind of gives you an idea of where it goes. And just to say, I had absolutely no idea when I obviously put the jury together what they were going to come up with. And when I staged it, so it's quite interesting. Normally it costs quite a few £1,000s to hire a courtroom to make a film. But because I happened to be a goldsmith and I was a student, I managed to hire the courtroom for £200. And but I had 1.5 hours. So I had to stage the whole trial, which I knew took about 45 minutes, twice, and just see what happened with the jury. And, basically ended up opting for the slightly more interesting, they were both really interesting, but that one, the kind of whole thing about Eichmann was fascinating. So, it is very much a kind of merger of like real life, real events, and a kind of fiction as well. I don't know if anyone's got any questions that they want to fire.
Well, I have a lot of questions for everyone, but I feel like all the talks that we had so far it's all a little bit about who is liable, who is responsible for the protection of our data, and also who owns the data. So it's like these 3 questions that are kind of revolving around it. And the first question that I would like to ask to you, Helen, is this is like also with the music, for example, it's quite a science fiction, but it's also kind of a horror in a way. It's like there's some sort of a dark scene there. Do you think that in the future it would be possible to trial non-human entities for the liability?
I think it's a really, I think it will happen. I think we are slowly moving towards a recognition. For some reason, human beings have I think it's to do with hierarchy. I mean, we're not just thinking about the non-human as in AI, but a non-human entity can be a mountain, it can be a river, it could be, I don't know, maybe it's a slab of concrete, and I think there's going to be a shift where we do start to broaden our thinking, but then at the same time it's always there's always the flip side. So I can really see the reason why we might want to give certain rights to things like mountains, right? So for instance, I've been recently reading a book by an anthropologist called Mariscal de la Cadena, who wrote a book called Earth Beings. And she talks about like the sort of struggles of a kind of a shaman in the Peruvian Andes and his relationship with a mountain. And, you know, politics does not recognize that mountain as a being, right? But in, you know, the shaman's world, that is entirely part of their relational kind of, you know, the community, you know, that's, so it kind of like the sort of normal politics doesn't recognize that, and therefore it kind of narrows what people and what they and who they are. So I do think, but then also like, you know, this like, you know, a mechanic kind of entity that, you know, maybe goes out of control. I don't know, do we ever have any control over non-humans? We don't have much control over nature. So anyway, that's a long, but yeah, I think so. I think there will be, it's going to change.
Yeah, it also feels like there is often, like, for example, in the case of the exhibition by Jonas Staal and Radha de Souza, they are gonna trial the companies rather that are, you know, that are polluting, for example. Whereas like these companies, they have rights as an entity, but they do not have the liability as an entity, which I think is always interesting, that there is this, I mean, they're the different sides of the coin, but they're not necessarily treated equally.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing about the asymmetry of power, I suppose, that Fieke was talking about, and, you know, where rules benefit one person and not another, or they benefit one thing and not another. So,
any of you want to respond to it?
Well, I think like Helen, I really liked your work. I think it's I like this quote about visibilizing seemingly invisible structures. That's like one of the most radical things you can do. And I feel like probably Susana as well. We've seen this in most of our work. I think, I mean, for me, the question always, I don't know how Helen or Susana deals with it, but it's this question about actually in this digital environment, what is actually new about it? Like this power asymmetry has always been there. Companies have always like misused and reappropriated stuff and have done extractivism. So what are the new things that like we should still be concerned with the old power structures, like who does all of this benefit, and then figure out what is the new about it. And sort of in this white paper, so that's one of the things then about like when does sort of who becomes responsible and liable, because I think that's a very legalized way of looking at it. So I feel the conversation should be far more fundamental than just like who is liable, because then we already assume it's okay to implement these as long as we can assign responsibility. And then at what point does this liability change from, for instance, the programmer to maybe a company who reappropriates it in a way that they never intended it to happen? But I think there's more sort of social dimensions behind all of these things than we actually care to acknowledge. So on the one hand, yes, technology is not neutral, and there's a lot of like inbuilt biases in there. But if you look at, for instance, the risk scoring algorithm that was brought to trial in the Netherlands, Siri, one of the reasons why it was found discriminatory was not only because maybe there's some issues with within the code, but that actually it was tried and tested in the 6 poorest neighborhoods of the country. Like by default, then you're already like profiling the poor instead of like maybe profiling everybody else. So behind a lot of these technologies is a very explicit agenda that somehow we never want to see, whether that's like extracting our behavioral data to make a lot of money out of it, in the case of Google, or in the case of the government to punish the poor. And these are very explicit, sort of seemingly invisible agendas, but that as soon as you flip the narrative a little bit or look at it from a different side, it becomes very obvious.
And in the white paper on artificial intelligence, there is these guidelines and that are kind of like options to propose to develop the ethical and trustworthy AI. Do you think that these assessment and frameworks are enough to become, like, to build some sort of a trustworthy AI?
So before the European Commission wrote the white paper on AI, which was supposed to be, von der Leyen promised AI legislation in 100 days, but because of a lot of external pressure and also which commissioners became responsible for this portfolio became sort of a strategy document instead of legislation. So there's a lot of politics already behind this. So before actually that happened, there was a high expert group on artificial intelligence that wrote like their recommendations for trustworthy AI, and they make really nice recommendations. I think my main challenge with all of these sort of ethical frameworks or optimizing is that on the one hand, then we sort of overlook the fundamental question: do we want this? Should this be implemented? In which cases shouldn't it be implemented? Are there red lines where we say, no, in these cases we will not implement it? So it already assumes that we're all okay with implementing, but just under specific conditions. So I think that's like the first step that sort of we have to acknowledge before we go into ethical guidelines. And then the other thing, ethics is just like a reason not to get legislation. No, it's like it's sort of self-regulation of an environment that's very extractivist. So I have quite some issues with ethics instead of regulation, where some could say ethics become regulation in the end. But you could see there's a lot of push from the big tech companies to create ethical frameworks, and that's not because they want to be so ethical. That's because they want to prevent legislation. So I think we have to be quite critical about these things.
And I think also the question rises whether we want our governments to kind of implement these things as well, because they are also party in themselves. No, they have, like, the way that they protect data or privacy is they have how do you say this? They want something out of that as well. I think maybe, yeah. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah. I have one comment about this, but then probably Helen or Susana wants to say something as well. If you closely read the AI white paper, it becomes really clear that public authorities, public institutions have several roles. And these roles are sort of like, on the one hand, they are seen, because we're missing consumer data, because consumer data is in the hands of American or Chinese tech companies. So they say like Europe should invest in industrial AI, which includes public authorities. So AI that can support public authorities on medicine, the electricity grid, but also other things. So public authorities should disclose their data to allow AI to be created on this. So on the one hand, they're a data source. Then we shouldn't forget that all of this tech would never have been there if it wasn't for public money. Like, the public investment made in technology is massive, even though Silicon Valley makes us believe that they invented it and it all comes from venture capitalists. Actually, a lot of this technology, from the internet to AI, actually is funded by public money in research organizations, research institutions. So they're like the data source, they're the investor in it. And then now the white paper also encourages public authorities to buy it. So then they also become the consumer of it. So I feel public authorities actually play multiple roles, and then they're legislator as well. And so we have to sort of be watchful on all four roles that they play in this.
And maybe a question for all of you, like, in terms of the resistance against AI, what responsibilities do you think individuals have, and especially in terms of protecting the data of vulnerable groups like activists and minorities? Maybe Susana, yeah.
I would like to take the word for this one. I think it's a bit all of what we're talking as is a conversation. We don't really have a definition of how things need to be done. And I think that's why all of these experiments with art and studies and people like me teaching tactics and testing things are necessary, and unnecessary that we meet people, regular people using it and suffering. I think it's really difficult to put the responsibility on users, just for what Fieke have mentioned. Technology change, tactics change, things that are now known and recommended maybe were useful in the past and not useful any longer, maybe something that we recommend now as a tool that can provide a security and privacy can get breached tomorrow. So it is really difficult, I see really difficult to make these people responsible alone. I think it's two sides. One is we need privacy by default, you know, like period. The thing is like when you go to talk to developers or to programmers or to software engineers, sorry to say, but they are really lousy about security and privacy. Mostly, I don't know, because personally they don't care, this, I don't know enough, but mostly I think is because it's the dynamic of the market. The business will not pay for that time, the time that they invest on security, on privacy, on making this architecture by default secure and private for us. So that's one of the responsibilities, which I think we should put more emphasis as users. And then when you are an activist, you have a lot of responsibility on you. You need to take care of the security of your people, of your communications, of your actions. You need to deal with police, with civil order, with a lot of mindsets there in your group. And you also need to know about politics, talking in public, tactics. It's too much responsibility we're asking just to one group. And I think this needs to be, I mean, they're responsible because, of course, if they're not, they don't ensure their own tactics and their own communications, they may endanger their own team. That's not the goal when you do activism, of course. However, this wall and capitalism surveillance is making it really, really hard because the chunks of information that state police of national security agencies can get from these people, if interested, is so tremendous that this gives them really little margin of organizing themselves online and being able to do it really secure. Because it is tricky, it's not so straightforward. It is different if you are trying to protect your photo that you are smoking from your mother, that if you are trying to protect that you are going to enter a national congress for this or that activity, you know, even if it's a ludic and visual activity only. So for sure, the needs of knowing, yeah, they're there. I think one of the things we do in Balkan Tactics is work with activists, whether they're in the Netherlands or abroad. I work a lot with Latin America and Spain, mostly because I'm not the Spanish speaker. But I think it's not only the responsibility, and it's just too easy for society to translate and transport the responsibility to the next one and not to assume us. We as users, and not only activists, but also users, like we already pay the internet connections, we already paid for the devices. The mobiles and computers are not cheap, internet connections are not cheap. And now we also have to pay with our time learning really complex security dimensions thereafter. So I just think we have to start asking and demanding software that is private by default. We really have to start clarifying our government's the policies and their position around this, because as we were mentioning, it's a bit of a lot of conflict of interest. We are really financing, supporting economically all of these developments, but then all of these developments are done with our money as individuals, but then it becomes a boomerang against our own privacy and our own possibilities. So it is like, I think, a plate for too many responsibility people, and not only activists. However, they need to ensure the security of their group, and because of that, they're forced to learn. If they're really under threat, meaning like they are really doing harm to this society or to this government, or they're changing, really making social change, then they will become monitored, like heavy monitored, and then it's really difficult to actually succeed. So that's why I think we all need to ask for encryption, we all need to ask for privacy by default, and we need to ask more, as you know, like why our emails can be read by anyone. Why Google has the capacity of reading our emails and we all don't care. It's like we I don't know, we do have responsibility, but not only to put to the only group that actually put time and intention on making change. I think it's too much to ask.
I just quickly answer that one. I suppose it's like, for me as an artist, it's artists are funny because they do traverse a lot of different parts of society, you know, from the kind of sort of shishi openings of like, you know, high-end art galleries down to like, you know, where my studio is, for instance, which is in East Manchester, which is incredibly sort of poor neighborhood. And I suppose so on some levels, I think artists have this quite privileged perspective of being able to see things from a lot of different different angles. And so sort of, I think there is a responsibility for a sort of criticality, but then also it's somehow the way to channel that into the imagination and, you know, hit people, you know, because most people don't care, like you say, Susana, you know, like they'll probably be like, oh, well, Google probably can't be bothered to read my email, you know. So, and then also, like, for instance, Fieke, you were talking about these protests, the student, my son actually, he's 18, and he was one of those kids that had their A-levels downgraded. And it was quite funny because he actually got really politicized by it, and he actually ended up going on Radio 4 and kind of like, you know, explaining the situation. But I'm not entirely sure, and it might have been my fault as his mother, whether he entirely understood why he'd been downgraded, right? He just knew that a wrong act had been done to him. Do you know what I mean? So it's also that thing of like, I suppose, yeah, just enabling people to really understand what's happening around them, you know? So.
But I think these student protests were what was so nice about this. Of course, it was not nice for the students impacted, but what was really nice about it, this is actually one of the first examples we have where the algorithm sort of irrespectful of like where you are in society, that it impacted everybody because it's a complete demographic. And then you see that it might not matter that you don't know the exact ins and outs about what happened, but that you know you've been wronged. And that was really unique about it. Like,
yeah, so people were very angry.
Yeah, and so they should. It's like,
yeah, because it was very arbitrary.
And
arbitrary.
It makes very clear that very super visual that that algorithms are not objective and they have like flaws, and yeah.
Algorithms tend to reflect the mentality of the people who have created. So, for example, I didn't know about your job, about your work, Helen. I really liked the idea of trial and algorithm. I think algorithms are really a new subject to study and talk and relate and to dig in. However, I think oh, I just missed what my point was. I'm sorry. When I get it back, I can.
Algorithms.
The bias.
The bias of, sorry, yes, true. So it is so much bias that my question would be like, it is wise to trial an algorithm, or if it's wise to actually trial the company behind that algorithm, you know, the process for creating an algorithm, what is the agenda that motivates that algorithm and not other, why that algorithm has those capacities or those ended points and not the others. Yeah. And to have less opacity around algorithms. The biggest problem for algorithms are most of the times not even their own programmers know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that is going to become a problem because we're talking about technology that goes beyond our capacities as human in so many areas and so many senses. And in a few years, there's going to be much distance between their capacities and our capacities and humans. And for me, all of this makes me wonder on how we're going to put tramples, how we're going to stop this, or how can we control it a bit and not just being leaves on the air in an atom.
Susana, I think that was the interesting thing, is that I originally had this idea that this algorithm was AI, right? That it could modify its behavior and that it did have some form of consciousness. And as I went through the process of making the film and, you know, and also I've done so many talks on this and in lots of different situations, it became very transparent that, you know, algorithms are programmed, they have parameters. You know, for instance, one time we had this sort of stage jury at the Zabludovich collection, and there was some coders there, and they just kept banging their fists on the table and saying, but it's like a recipe. It's like a recipe, you know, it's just a series of like instructions. But there's always this interesting sort of uneasy question around that recipe. Okay, it does X, Y, and Z, but it also interacts with the world. And you can't sort of, you can't predict how it's going to interact with the world. And then, you know, maybe there's a feedback loop, you know, and like, I suppose for me, it's kind of like this cusp of like something being, yes, it's just an algorithm and the coders are responsible, but at what point does that technology start to shift? You know, like, I don't know. I don't think we're there yet, but I think it's on the horizon.
I remember, Susana, in the beginning of your talk, you said something that I thought was very interesting, where you said that once you lose your privacy, it's also kind of lost. And I'm just wondering if we would manage to implement laws and ways to protect ourselves, would that be able to be implemented also on hindsight, or is all the data that is now out there, is there going to be a whole generation that has lost their privacy and we are protecting the people that are coming next, or is that reversible process?
Wow, this is a complex answer question. So whoever wants to help, please go on. Yeah, I think all of this is really relative, because privacy is really tailored to one. What for me is necessary privacy, maybe for you is lower or you need higher. So this is like the first part that we need to understand, that privacy is really tailored to each one. So that's why it's so difficult to measure, to contain her or to explain her. When you lose your privacy, meaning, for example, there's just come from my head, there was a situation in Spain about a woman having consensual sex with a partner. Then this partner disappeared, but then this person decided a few years after to share this video, which they have consent, to everybody in the workplace of this woman. This woman, the situation happened 4 years after she had the situation. She was happily married and with children. She committed suicide because this video was on the WhatsApps of all her co-workers, and she was working in a business of around, I think, if I remember wrong, 2,000 or 3,000 people. Of course, this opened a debate in Spain of everything. But what I mean is, for this woman, this debate is too late. When she did this video, she was consensual. So it's not at, you know, what I think is important to understand about privacy is that things that you do today very happily and very agreeing can become a threat to you in the future. This is a very dramatic case, a very maybe specific, but who hasn't shared nudes with her partners, who haven't shared these things, you know, who has not have nude photos of herself or of themselves somewhere in their devices. And maybe that's no problem, maybe it becomes a problem. So it's like, it's really difficult to define how to do this. For me, it's like the active conscience of what are you doing. But I agree with Fieke that if we don't understand how internet works and how this impacts our privacy, it is really difficult to put doors to the field, we say in Spain. You know, you just cannot put doors to the field because the field is open. So we're now in this situation where technology goes really fast, where companies' greed is bigger even. Governments are in a conflict of interest because they are between supporting the lobbies which support their own parties and defending or trying to defend the civilians that they represent. And we also have all of these civilians in between, which we mostly don't understand enough of these technologies, but still are affecting us. So I think it's morally for us to protect future generations, but also we are protecting us because we don't know how this data is going to be used. We can imagine from learning from the past or from our own experience or from neighbor experience, but we cannot know exactly what's going to happen. That's why we in privacy, we stress so much about open source and audits and these kind of things, because that's now some solutions, real solutions to know what at least they're doing with our data. Because from Google, we know they read our data and they sell it to give us tailored or personalized advertisements, but we don't know what else they're doing. We really don't know. We know they're training artificial intelligence, but we don't know how they're doing it. So it's like it's kind of it's kind of difficult, big, and I would say, yeah, difficult for me to try to give you an answer besides all of this bubbling around. So I don't know if my colleagues here want to add something with more head.
Maybe it's good if some of you want to respond, but I'm also becoming a bit aware of the time, and maybe there's some closing statements that you would like to make in regards to this or previous topics.
Well, I would like to add to Susana. I think what is the most difficult thing to understand for going into the future is actually when Susana said, once you give up your privacy, it's gone forever. It's like at certain moment, data also gets old or stale and it becomes less valuable. But it's really difficult to understand which data will become old and which data will remain active for who. And I think this is something like none of us has figured out yet, but still it will impact our future lives. So I think this is one of the tricky parts about data, about what maybe is private today is not private tomorrow, and what's not private today might actually be private tomorrow because it has gone stale or old. No, maybe, and I'll start the closing comments. Like I'll have a quick one. I think we just have to be critical. We have to start engaging and sort of demanding that people explain what they're doing, because all of this stuff is happening. They don't have to give any accountability to it. It's just like all of a sudden there's like cameras in the Vondelpark, cameras in like all these test areas in Amsterdam, and they have like a little sign and nobody has to explain why they're doing it, for instance. And even if that's the first step, like I think that's a small first step, but it's like an important first step. And we all should get engaged in the conversation because it will impact us all at a different moment in our lives.
Just to say, I mean, my feeling is it feels like a moment, especially because of COVID, you know, of absolute tech solutionism, where, you know, for instance, you know, suddenly the pandemic's over because we have a vaccine, and yet, you know, what the pandemic has really highlighted is the fact that, you know, there's huge swathes of the population that have health inequalities, you know, and, you know, if there was just some movement, you know, of course, vaccines are really important, but like, surely it's also really important to acknowledge, you know, how to control a virus by creating better conditions for everybody, you know. And so it's just kind of like this whole thing about like, you know, who makes the decisions that, you know, tech's going to have all the answers. We just have to be really, really critical and have the chance to, you know, have forums like this, you know, but also forums that are like, you know, this is obviously quite, you know, it's contemporary art and it's a more exclusive forum, you know, it's like, how do we get the message out to a wider group of people that, you know, there are issues, basically.
All right. Yeah, I think maybe democratization and explanation is a good note to end. If you don't have nothing more to say, I want to thank you all, Fieke and Susana and Helen, for these interesting talks, and also everyone that is watching. Thank you very much for your input. And
I would like to make something before we go. It's for me been a pleasure to have play with all of you, and all of you being women. Normally in these technology panels, it's only men. So thank you for Destiny or for whomever was behind only putting women behind this panel. And also, like, I wanted to add that I think better security, I mean, it means the whole system wants us to feel hopeless, like we have no control and we cannot move further, and we just have to accept that we have lost privacy, as many of these Google gurus have said before. But I really believe that the better security and privacy are obtained because of simple choices and some knowledge. So I will try to incentivize everybody to actually learn. There are a lot of resources around there, or persons like me willing to share our knowledge, and it is a knowledge that is not going to harm you. It's only going to help you moving forward. So make use of and don't be afraid. Just be humble and go slowly. Learn what you need and use it, and go on.
Okay, thank you so much. I just want to mention that our next event and the Uproot series will shift away from the digital extraction to extractivism of more natural, like actual natural, whatever that may be, resources through agricultural mining. And we will announce this through our social media channels, so stay tuned for that. And thank you all again, and have a nice eve.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Ciao.
Bye.